All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Equitable Resilience and Planning Frameworks. I'm Julissa Gilmore. I'm the Senior Program Manager of Environmental Justice Programs at Groundwork USA. I'm also joined by Renee Mazurek. I'm the Resilient Communities Manager at River Network, who will be moderating our Q&A today. So just a few housekeeping. Of course, there's a lot of us here today. Please keep yourself on mute. And then we also have closed captioning available for anyone who needs it. And so, yeah, it would be great if you all can introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, your organization, and where you are calling in or joining us from. Next slide. Okay, so again, thank you for joining us today. This webinar is hosted by the Urban Waters Learning Network, which is coordinated by the River Network and Groundwork USA. We're funded by the Environmental Protection Agency and the National Park Service. And the Urban Waters Learning Network is a nationwide peer-to-peer network of people and organizations working to conserve, restore, and revitalize America's waterways. Next slide. So today's webinar is focused on equitable resilience planning frameworks and how we can engage and center the needs of the most vulnerable community members when developing climate resilience, disaster preparedness, and other related plans. And so we started off this series in July talking about the connection between historic land use policy and the disparate impacts of climate change on communities of color and low-income communities and how they face a greater climate risk. And so we also explored different ways that communities on the front lines are building capacity to tackle these climate risks, from resilience hubs to community-led research to leadership programs. Cities across the country are recognizing that the very real threat of climate change is a very real threat, and it's happening now, and that we need to plan for a world where extreme weather events become more and more frequent. So as some of us are beginning and some of us are continuing to plan, it's important that the people closest to this issue are not only involved in the planning for a changing climate, but also driving those solutions. And so our two speakers today will share some examples of community-driven plans that center local knowledge on climate impacts and advance community priorities. But before we introduce our speakers, we'd love to hear from you with a poll. So there's 3 questions in this poll. And so what entity do you represent, your experience with resilience planning efforts, and where those plans centered in the community? And so we'll give you just a minute or 2 to answer those questions.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Go ahead and take a little bit of time to fill out the 3 questions on this poll, and we will share the results when they come back in. Almost halfway there on participation in the poll. Thanks. Keep it going. And keep it open for about 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Thank you for responding. Let me see if I can share these results with everybody. So primary affiliation, we've got a little bit of everybody in here. Looks like local, county, and state government is the highest at 26%. Nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, as well as tribal government, learning institutions, and other. If you would like to share in the chat what other is for you, please do. And then the level of experience with climate resilient action or disaster preparedness planning. Overwhelmingly 60% some experience, some with none, 18% with a lot of experience, and 1% other. And then if you have experience with these plans, have they been informed by community and reflect frontline community priorities? 68% somewhat, 22% completely, and 10% not at all. So thank you so much for sharing, and I'll hand it back over to Jaleesa.
Great. Thanks, Renee, and thanks everyone for participating. It's really good to see a diverse audience and all the experience you all have. So I want to introduce our two wonderful speakers today. And so our first speaker is Chantal Madray, and she is a network weaver, resilience planner, strategist, storyteller, and project manager for the People's Climate Innovation Center. She manages the National Association of Climate Resilience Planners, a multi-stakeholder, peer-to-peer learning resource and referral network that fosters effective place-based climate resilience planning and implementation through frontline community leadership and accountability. In this deeply relational role, Chantal ensures that equity is at the center of the NACRP network development, membership, expansion, and partnerships. She supports the design and implementation of core NACRP offerings, including the annual NACRP Facilitators Credential Program, which uplifts the principles and practices of community-driven planning to cultivate a growing field of practitioners and bring about transformational systems level change that subverts the traditional top-down approach to planning and makes community-driven planning the norm. And Annie, we're also joined by Annie Carforo. Annie is the Climate Justice Campaigns Manager at We Act for Environmental Justice. She is responsible for engaging We Act members and residents of Northern Manhattan in the organization's climate policy initiatives and overseeing policies and programs that promote equitable land use in the community. Prior to joining We Act, Annie organized alongside New Yorkers experiencing homelessness on city and state legislation designed to improve access to high-quality, affordable housing. All of Annie's organizing and policy experience is grounded in community-led activism. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Human and Organizational Development with a focus on community development from Vanderbilt University, and currently is pursuing a Master's of Urban Planning degree at Hunter College with a focus on equity and sustainability in city planning. So thank you to both of our speakers today. And just a reminder to, as both Chantal and Annie are presenting, drop questions in the chat and we'll get to them when we moderate the Q&A after Annie is finished presenting. And then, yeah, before I hand it over to Chantal, I think we have one more poll to see just what's your interest in networking with others in this space and this community. We've all come to listen today about the same topic. So yeah, we would love to hear your interest in networking with others.
Thank you for weighing in on this poll as well. This is part of a series and we have been asking this question every time. And so stay tuned for more opportunities if your answer to this question is yes. And if the poll for some reason doesn't work for you, you can always drop your email address in the chat or send it directly to me in the chat. And I can collect email addresses and contact information that way as well. We are almost at 75% of participation. We'll give it a couple of more seconds. And 3, 2, 1. Again, if you are interested, you can drop your name in the chat. I will just share results here so you can all see 71% of you have said yes. So this is, there's a lot of interest in this topic and we know it. And like I said, stay tuned.
Great, thanks Renee. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Chantal.
Thank you so much. I'm just gonna take a second to get my slides up. All right, can I see a thumbs up if you can see that? All
We
right.
are seeing your presenter panel, Chantal, on top of the slide.
Okay.
There you go. It's gone now.
1 second, let me retry.
Just a reminder, if you're just joining us, you can drop your name, organization, and where you're joining us from. And feel free to throw any questions into the chat and we'll moderate it during the Q&A portion.
Was it showing my notes before? I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
Sure.
I'm not sure why. I'm not sure how to get the notes off of the screen. If you don't mind showing the PDF for me.
Yeah, you bet.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, that's not what I'm supposed to be showing, is it?
Yeah, that's correct.
Is it? Okay, good. Wait. What can you see? Sorry, folks. Let me.
No problem. Right now we're seeing the Urban Waters Learning Network slides.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, and I think I can control them from my end, so that's good.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for bearing with me, everyone. Good afternoon to you or good morning, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Chantal, and I'm a programs manager for the National Association of Climate Resilience Planners, or NACRP for short. And I'm located on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway. And NACRP is also a core program of People's Climate Innovation Center. And I just want to say a huge thank you again, and thanks for bearing with me. At the beginning, I was just sharing, I haven't had any technical difficulties to date, but I guess I jinxed it. All right, so in the work that we do alongside frontline communities, it's important that we always start from the beginning. So from our origin story, and I'll share a little bit of that with you. In 2013 to 2014, a small group of us were working under Movement Strategy Center, MSC. They began collaborating with partners and leaders in climate justice across the country toward the development of what is now the community-driven climate resilience planning framework that I'll talk about a little bit more in depth later. In 2015, the climate team formed formally within MSC. And in 2017, we launched the framework, which also prompted the need for and launch of the NACRP itself. From 2018 to 2020, the climate team at MSC began launching a series of programs that you can see on the screen around youth leadership, community power building, and capacity building. We also
I'm
held.
sorry. I'm not from the River Network, but Chantal, we're only seeing your first slide and we're seeing your whole screen. So if you've been advancing through slides, that hasn't been seen.
Okay. Let me see.
I can do
still
that.
on the-
I can do the moving of slides if you just want to give me, Chantal, a signal. Can everybody see a beautiful illustration now?
Yeah, I'm still on the illustration.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, kind of walking us through the timeline.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, so in 2019, we had our very first NACRP in-person gathering with a bunch of our founding members. And in 2020, we all know what happened in 2020, but during the same year, our climate team transitioned from a project partner under MSC to its very own nonprofit, People's Climate Innovation, or Climate Innovation for short. And fast forward to today, we are growing rapidly and thriving as an all BIPOC female-led nonprofit. And as we like to say, it's sort of our mantra or motto, we're manifesting abundance together to build community power for climate resilience and advance racial and climate justice. So maybe I can get some virtual snaps for that. All right, what is community-driven planning? For us, community-driven planning is about self-determination for Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian and Pacific Islander communities. We need capacity in our communities to develop our own solutions and plans. And to do that, we need to replace the exclusionary practices of top-down planning. And so at Climate Innovation, we really promote practices that ensure climate solutions meet the real needs of climate-impacted communities by centering frontline leadership and frontline accountability. And our community-driven climate resilience framework, it's a mouthful, is now available in both English and Spanish to demonstrate our commitment to language justice. And the framework, although it's in the title and it's organized around climate resilience planning, it's actually more extensive and deeper than that. And I'll talk through what I mean by that. The framework, as I mentioned before, was developed through a series of gatherings with climate justice leaders around the country who were working in different ways to interrupt or intervene in top-down planning processes by engaging the voices of those most impacted and disinvested communities. The framework's developers saw a need to engage the expertise, the knowledge, and the practices of climate justice leaders within these frontline communities who were advocating for better planning when it comes to withstanding the climate crisis and having access to essential needs like water, food, energy, healthcare, housing, education, etc. And so through these efforts, the framework developers learned that it's our communities that are building deep democracy. And these levels of participation need to be part of climate resilience planning to really transform our systems and allow for that deep, direct participation of communities from the beginning of the planning process, so not the middle or end of the process. And to accomplish this, it was clear that there needed to be shared language, a shared set of language and a framework to be able to talk about the need to transform community engagement and our overall culture of participation so that planning processes truly center those most impacted in a way that translates to real roles and power and decision-making processes, shared power.
Chantal, can you give me a nudge when we're on the first slide? I don't know if you can see the slides I'm sharing. Can you? Just to make sure I'm on the right slide, and give me a nudge when you want me to advance.
Okay, yes, you're on the correct slide. Next slide, please.
Great. Next.
Okay. These are the essential elements and capacities needed for communities to develop and effectively address climate impacts through our community-driven approach. The first is vision. This is the capacity to put forward a vision of climate resilience and assert a set of community priorities that flow from that vision. Solutions development, this is the capacity to assess community vulnerabilities and assess assets, and develop appropriate solutions based on what a community's unique experience is. And lastly, power building. This is the capacity to build community voice and power to get those solutions resourced, which is the term we use for funded and implemented. Next slide. This is what we call the wheel in a web that shows how each element works together. And I want to emphasize that this is not a menu of options to choose from. All elements must be involved in the community-driven planning process, but they might not happen at the same time or order that this is in. The community-driven planning process calls for multi-stakeholder, multi-sector teams and collaboration, and a whole systems approach is needed to get at the root causes of climate disruption and social inequities. So I'll kind of walk us through the different elements of this web, which again are in our framework. The first is community-driven planning model development. This is in the pre-planning phase where cross-sector coalitions of community-based organizations and resident leaders come together to define their core values, their principles, practices, and approaches for community-driven planning. The second is power building, which is about investing in both people and systems to build cross-sector coalitions, increase self-governance, and democratic engagement capacity, as well as build strategies and connection across all levels of governance structures and stakeholders. Next, there's visioning, which, as I mentioned before, refers to defining the overall goal, making sure that it's community derived and inspires cohesion, as well as motivates engagement towards the work that lies ahead. Problem definition that involves identifying a shared and holistic understanding across stakeholders of the nature of the challenges that the community faces. Then there's community assessment. This is a participatory process, engaging residents in assessing their climate vulnerabilities and resilience assets or opportunities. Second to last, we have solutions development. This involves two complementary strategies. The first is transforming existing systems, and the second is building a new climate resilient civic and economic infrastructure. And lastly, there's keeping the public planning process on track, quote, on track. This refers to interventions to ensure the planning process maintains its integrity and its commitment to community-derived solutions and processes for equitable outcomes, as that's the goal. Next slide. So in speaking with and convening leading practitioners of this holistic approach to community-driven planning, we were able to distill it down into these 5 guiding principles, and they're also described in the framework. Those principles are whole systems thinking. As we know, climate change impacts many of us across society, and aspects including energy, water, food systems, and so on. And so this requires a holistic understanding of the complex challenges we face and holistic solutions, since everything is connected to everything else. Desired outcomes reflected in every step. Outcomes and principles such as equity and community-based planning should be embedded in each step of the planning process, as well as the implementation process. Planning process as a learning process. Community-driven planning fosters multidimensional learning across governance levels, meaning learning goes across and between stakeholders and sectors to increase understanding of the causes and the consequences of climate disruption, as well as processes and pathways to address it. Planning into action. This involves making sure everything is in place for implementation. So that could include things like resources, capacity, technical assistance, and leadership readiness, just to name a few. And lastly, there's balancing power dynamics among stakeholders. And this one is twofold. There are procedural power dynamics. So it's important to increase awareness of systems of oppression and exclusionary practices or cultures that perpetuate power imbalances and contribute to climate vulnerability. It's important that decision makers share that power in the planning and implementation process, and community groups increase their capacity to step into that power. The second set of dynamics, they're referred to as substantive power dynamics, and this refers to the need to increase access and control over essential resources at the community level. So this is to reduce community vulnerability and also reduce the likelihood of power imbalances in the planning process. Next slide. So now I'd like to transition to talking a little bit more about NACRP, the National Association of Climate Resilience Planners, and the work that I do more specifically. I'm helping us to grow a national network of community-driven planning facilitators who are trained in the principles of the framework that I shared with you. The majority of our network is made up of grassroots organizers and multi-sector partners to do this work. And as I mentioned before, we're super intentional about taking a whole systems approach to movement building, elevating solutions that are community-driven, interconnected, and that intervene at multiple levels in the system, if you will, with the ultimate goal of shifting and subverting traditional top-down planning to be accountable to and led by frontline communities. Next slide, please. To sort of summarize that, the NACRP and People's Climate Innovation Center are working to make community-driven planning the norm. We're working to shift, subvert, and ultimately transform the top-down status quo that is planning today, and to nurture a growing community of practice by building power through various capacity building opportunities that I'll talk through in a moment. So this is how we're showing up and demonstrating our accountability to frontline communities. Next slide. I am super excited to share with you all that we have finally launched phase 1 of our new website last month, and phase 2 will be launched in early 2024. It will include a member portal, a VPS alumni portal for folks who have attended our workshops, and also a facilitator portal for our growing network of trained facilitators in these principles and practices. So I've shared a link to put in the chat. So hopefully you all are able to check it out. Next slide, please. And so I was asked to share a little bit about how we're building capacity for community-driven planning. So I brought a few examples with me. The first is through that Vision Powers Solutions workshop series that I just mentioned. We first launched the series in 2021, and since then, we have connected with over 800 participants who've been part of the series. And this is kind of like community-driven planning 101, if you will, where we walk through the fundamentals so folks are clear on the principles and the practices of community-driven planning. And then after each workshop, about 2 weeks after, we have this applied practice peer cipher to intentionally foster that peer learning where folks bring challenges that they're facing in their day-to-day work as they relate to the workshop topic so that they can workshop it with their peers in real time. The second example is our facilitator certification program, which was launched in 2022. And this is helping us to grow a trained facilitator network across the country and a referral network. So say we receive an RFP or an inquiry that says, hey, I'm doing a community-driven planning project in Philadelphia. Do you have any facilitators in the Mid-Atlantic region? We would kind of play the role of matchmaker to match our facilitators that are trained in these principles to folks who are in those communities and areas. So that's really exciting that we're starting to grow that out. Let's see. Okay, next slide, please. Yes. So some of our new offerings coming in the new year include our Community-Driven Planning Fund, which NACRP members are eligible to apply to. And that will award up to $25,000 to support community-driven planning projects. And then also we are working to launch a TA or technical assistance resource hub. And all of these are in response to the direct needs of our membership. So we try to do that as much as possible and are continually seeking and asking for feedback and what the needs are so that we can meet them. And so this is just a summary of how our capacity building offerings are connected to support this growing community of practice and larger ecosystem of work. I definitely encourage you all to check out our community spotlights on our website. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry. I encourage you all to check out our community spotlights that are on our website to read about how the framework has been applied at the community level. I could probably give an entire presentation on each one of these on the screen. And so next slide, please. I also encourage you to have a look at our blog series. The series features stories from frontline organizers in our capacity building programs, many of which have gone through that facilitator training program. And I personally feel like no one can tell the stories better than the folks who were on the ground doing the work. So I encourage you to check those out as well. And with that, next slide, please. Just wanted to say a huge thank you again, and thanks for bearing with me with the slides. I haven't had that happen before.
Thanks, Chantal. I think as we transition to the next speaker, we've had a couple of questions come in that are specifically for you, and I think we have a few minutes to get to at least one of them. And one of the question is, does your organization work in rural communities or urban only?
We don't really specify the type of community. We're more so focused on communities as a whole. So from the neighborhood level to multiple communities working together, we're also trying to bridge and support and foster partnerships between communities and the city, communities and local government. We're also looking to develop a VPS series that's just on working with local government next year. So to answer your question, rural and urban.
That's great. It's a big need for both, I think. I think I will hand it over to Annie and keep the questions coming. I will collect them and we can come back to some of them after our second speaker.
Thank you so much, Renee, and thank you, Chantal. I think that is a really excellent segue into talking about applying community-driven planning in a local context. So can everybody see my screen? Let's see, are we all right?
Yep, looks great.
Awesome. Okay. So I am going to talk about some community planning that WEACT has done to prepare our neighborhoods for extreme heat, for extreme weather, which in Harlem, New York, which is where WEACT is founded, the main extreme weather events that we experience are both flooding and extreme heat. So I'm going to get into all about kind of how we got to the planning process and what that looked like and the outcomes that we had. And before I jump into that, just to introduce myself again, my name is Annie. I am the Climate Justice Campaign Manager with WEACT. We are a community-based organization that was founded in West Harlem. We work in Northern Manhattan, which we consider to be East Harlem, Central Harlem, West Harlem, Washington Heights, and Inwood, also Indigenous Lenape land. And I'm very excited to get to talk to you all about this, our Climate Ready Uptown plan, which is a really positive experience in community-driven planning. Just quickly to go over WEACT for Environmental Justice. We were founded in 1988 by our current executive director, who's a co-founder, Peggy Shepard. And WEACT formed as an organization that was resisting very blatant environmental racism that was happening in Manhattan. and was particularly targeting neighborhoods like West Harlem that were saturated with polluting facilities, poor air quality, limited green space, and high rates of other environmental hazards. And We ACT formed as a resistance movement to demand community-driven political change. And our victories are We ACT's birth story, I guess, is one of victory. So Peggy Shepard, along with our two other co-founders, Vernice Miller-Travis and Chuck Sutton, organized the community to protest the city's placement of a sewage treatment plant that was intended to be on the west side of Manhattan in a neighborhood called Chelsea, New York, which is a very high-income neighborhood that has a lot of resources and political influence, and we're able to convince the city to move the sewage treatment plant up into the coastline of West Harlem, a neighborhood that was already overburdened with bus depots, diesel bus depots, marine transfer stations, all of the infrastructure that cities need to run were all piled into one very small area, and it was having a negative impact on the health of the residents. And so on top of that, when the city and state built the sewage treatment plant, they actually built it incorrectly. And so there was evidence that there were toxic pollutants that were actually spilling out of the sewage treatment plant that should not have been, and were were creating respiratory problems for the people in the surrounding community. So we ACT, with the help of the NRDC, actually sued the Department of Environmental Protection over their negligent operation of the sewage treatment plant, and won. And this was pretty groundbreaking for a small community-based organization to go up against the city and win. And there was a $1.1 million settlement, which we ACT used to actually hire its first staff and rent space in a building uptown. And we've been here ever since. Now we've grown into a local, state, and national leader in the environmental justice movement. And our work has expanded to cover, a dozen focus areas, but some of them ranging from fighting for clean air to sustainable land use, to toxic-free products, to open green spaces. And in particular, our recent shift has been really focused on climate justice, making sure that our transition off of fossil fuels is one that is equitable, that is not repeating the same mistakes of the past. And a big part of our work has also grown into resiliency and adaptation, because we know that while we must, ensure that we are reducing the impacts of climate change for the future, we also know that climate change is already here, and it's harming frontline communities, and communities that have contributed the least are typically the ones that are getting are facing the most extreme impacts. And in New York, I think the biggest wake-up call that we had was Hurricane Sandy in 2012 that caused, it was considered a one in 1,000-year storm, and it caused incredible damage across the city, but particularly really harmed low-income communities of color that were in line for the storm. So they were in neighborhoods that were disproportionately impacted and flooded. And what happened in the aftermath was that the city really fumbled the response. And lots of communities were more or less left to their own devices to clean up their neighborhoods and to come together and really help people who help their neighbors and build back from the storm. And Harlem was one of those neighborhoods. East Harlem experienced pretty extreme flooding. The way that the neighborhood is built, and you'll get to actually see this on a map later, it formerly was actually an estuary where 3 rivers merged. And so it's very low-lying, it's very vulnerable to flooding. And during Hurricane Sandy was experiencing in some places up to 10 feet of flooding. And there was very little response in city response afterwards. And so that really mobilized a lot of people into action. And from WEACT's end, it drove the creation of the Northern Manhattan Climate Adaptation Plan, which was actually featured on the website for models of community-driven planning. This was a process that took almost 3 years to complete. It included about 7 months of really intense community-led planning. We held community charrettes with over 700 residents of Northern Manhattan, with countless community-based organizations, city agencies, elected officials, and came up with a roadmap or an adaptation plan for what our vision for a resilient Northern Manhattan would look like. And it stood on 4 pillars of expanding social and resiliency hubs in the neighborhood, energy democracy, emergency preparedness, and public participation in politics. And so the Northern Manhattan Climate Adaptation Plan has been a sort of roadmap for WEAC's policy and advocacy work moving forward since its completion in 2015, which brings us to the emergency preparedness side and talking about extreme weather, because everybody in Northern Manhattan has some very recent memories since Hurricane Sandy, but even more recent than that, of extreme weather really coming and knocking on the front door. Northern Manhattan is incredibly vulnerable to flooding. It's very hilly in Northern Manhattan. Not a lot of people realize that. And so some areas, while they're protected because of, just the geographic incline, they're up higher. Other parts of our neighborhood are down low and are really vulnerable to floods. And in the past 3 years, we've seen some pretty terrifying flooding just from extreme rain. So we haven't seen another coastal storm the way that Hurricane Sandy hit, but instead we're seeing, 2 to 3 inches of rain fall in an hour, and our city's infrastructure is completely overwhelmed and unable to handle that. And so some of these pictures here are, commonly visited areas in the neighborhoods that we work in that are absolutely inundated with floodwater from some major storms that have hit in the last 3 years. Oh, that's a video, but we're gonna keep moving. And this is a map to just show, the data of Northern Manhattan's vulnerability. While the, we are very vulnerable to, especially in East Harlem, which is this neighborhood that kind of butts out on the right, to coastal flooding, that's showing the 100-year and 500-year floodplains. What Northern Manhattan is even more vulnerable to, is, as I mentioned, is this extreme, is this flooding from extreme rain, or pluvial flooding is what the technical definition. And what's pretty interesting is the map on the right is actually a fairly new data set. So New York City hired a group called Urban Systems Labs, which does data visualization, and they are a really excellent community partner to help communities understand, interpret, and digest data. And New York City hired them to create a stormwater flood map, which was the first of its kind when it was released in 2021, which mapped, based on a bunch of technical analyses that I cannot explain, mapped where it is anticipated to flood when we have these extreme rainstorms, which they defined as 3.5 inches of rain in an hour. And this was, so this is Northern Manhattan's vulnerability. And this was a really important tool because I think that after Hurricane Sandy, most people were thinking about coastal storms as the biggest risk. And we're underestimating the reality that these extreme rainstorms are happening much more frequently and are causing much more damage. And so this is going to come kind of back into the picture a little bit later, but this was a real breakthrough in helping us understand our risk to extreme weathers, in particular flooding. Northern Manhattan is also extremely vulnerable to heat. New York City has what's called a heat vulnerability index, which shows neighborhoods whose residents are more at risk for dying during or immediately following an extreme heat event. And it combines a number of social and environmental factors, including surface temperatures, green space, access to air conditioning, and the percent of residents who are low income or non-Latinx Black. And as you can see on this map, East Harlem in particular and Central Harlem have the highest heat vulnerability index score that the city ranks, along with pretty much all of the Bronx. And this is no accident. There is a direct correlation between race and vulnerability to heat. In New York City, we see that Black residents die from heat-related illnesses at a disproportionately high rate. They make up 50% of heat-related deaths, even though they're only 25% of the population. And again, this is by design. There's a clear through line that more and more analyses are showing that communities that were formerly redlined in the 1930s and 40s and 50s were today have less green space, less green land coverage, and higher surface temperatures. And we see that in neighborhoods like East and Central Harlem, where there is a lot of hard infrastructure, a lot of blacktops, not a lot of trees, not a lot of parks. And it leads to, on average, neighborhoods like East Harlem being 8 degrees hotter than the city's average on any given day. And that's exacerbated when there's an extreme heat event. And we also have one of the lowest rates of air conditioning in the city. So not that many people have access to air conditioning, which can be life-saving during an extreme heat event. This was a study that was actually done, and it was in the New York Times, but there was a reporter that walked around with a heat radar, and on the same day, a block in East Harlem was actually 31 degrees hotter than a block in the Upper West Side. And you can see just visually from these pictures, the clear, disinvestment in one community over the other. And again, we can trace this back through history to, systemic racism in the way that we planned and invested in our communities. So our members of We Act, and in particular, I work with members through our Climate Justice Working Group, which is an opportunity for members to get more engaged in our policy work related to climate justice. And there was a feeling after we created the Northern Manhattan Climate Adaptation Plan, we saw these extreme rain flood events. We went through one of the hottest summers on record. And there was a feeling from our members that we needed to be doing more around emergency preparedness. It was one of our key pillars in our Northern Manhattan Climate Adaptation Plan. And we had not really moved forward on any meaningful work or projects in that space in the time between then and now. And so taking heed from our members' input, we actually did a survey and a voting process within our Climate Justice Working Group to try and figure out where we wanted to focus our energy for the next coming year. And overwhelmingly, people voted that they wanted to work on an emergency preparedness plan to help people prepare and understand their risks when it comes to both extreme heat and flooding. So picking up this, the torch, we went out into the community and really did a survey of the existing landscape, because we did not want to be repetitive to some of the really hard work that's already happening among community groups. And so we connected with two absolutely incredible local community-based organizations, the East Harlem COAD and the Harlem Emergency Network, which are both doing really important emergency preparedness work for a host of issues far beyond just extreme weather, and talk to them about our idea of creating an extreme weather climate change specific plan. And we were surprised to learn that while flooding was definitely on their radar as something that was an emergency, extreme heat was not considered an emergency by these two groups. And so we saw an opportunity for a symbiotic relationship where, they were providing their expertise in emergency planning, and we were providing our expertise in understanding the risks of extreme heat as well as flooding. And so we did a survey of the landscape of what existing tools are out there. And it's important to note that New York City's Office of Emergency Management has tons of resources to help households, businesses, communities prepare for extreme weather events. The information is out there, but what we found from talking to both East Harlem COAD and Harlem Emergency Network, as well as our own members and as well as other community members that We Act interacts with, was that a lot of the materials that were presented by our Office of Emergency Management did not feel accessible for the average person that is not doing emergency planning on a day-to-day basis. Even these groups that are doing emergency planning often felt that the materials that were put out by the city were not relatable and were really hard to engage people on. And so what we did was hosted in January of 2022, we hosted a community meeting that was open to anybody in Northern Manhattan. We had about 40 people join us on Zoom. And we went into breakout rooms and talked through different scenarios related to an extreme heat situation and a flooding situation. And we had people talk about, we wanted to understand what people's understanding of emergency preparedness already was, what understanding of what their risk level was, and understanding of what their barriers to being a resilient community were. And so we went through questions of, identifying who is most at risk in their community, who are their neighbors, their members that they believe to be at a heightened vulnerability or at heightened risk, and why. What were the underlying root causes that were leading to that higher rate of vulnerability? Then we talked through thinking about a response to an emergency situation, right? What are the services or the resources that you would want in this situation that we laid out in the scenario? And what are the barriers that you have to accessing those? And then we talked through planning. What would you do before this emergency to prepare for it? And how could you strengthen that, or how could you improve your response to this? And so we collected a ton of data from these different breakout rooms. I believe we had about 4 different breakout rooms. And I meant to say we did this in collaboration with the East Harlem Co-ed and the Harlem Emergency Network to understand not only where our community members were at with emergency preparedness and their understanding of their exposure to extreme heat and flooding, but also what was the language that they were using to describe emergency preparedness, community preparedness, vulnerability, resiliency, et cetera. And then we got to work. So within the Climate Justice Working Group, we actually created a subcommittee that for 6 months did really incredible synthesizing of information that existed with the city. We took the city's resources and really pulled out what is the key information that we want in our plan. And what did we learn from our conversations with our community members, from our community meeting, from the expertise of the East Harlem Co-ed and the Northern Manhattan, the Harlem Emergency Network. And we started to put together a draft plan. And we were actually really fortunate to be able to partner with Urban Systems Labs, who I mentioned earlier, who had created the stormwater flooding map for the city, to put together the visuals and for our emergency preparedness plan, who helped us basically design it and lay out some important data sets. And so we were really working at this point to synthesize the information that we had and make this information more accessible. But we still wanted to have as much community input to make this the best version of itself as we could. So we hosted some very, very focused community focus groups where we invited community members from across the 5 neighborhoods in Northern Manhattan that were community leaders, not necessarily experts in emergency preparedness, but who were in touch and had very deep roots and relationships with different communities across our area. We ran through our original version of the plan, and we did a line by line to collect as much feedback from them as possible. Everybody got their own draft and was able to mark it up and give us feedback on the visuals, the language, the messaging, the information, the data, so that we could then, take that and adapt it into, an even stronger version of the plan. And so we went through this process. We went through the process with Urban Systems Labs, back and forth, tweaking our plan into something that was, I think, as responsive as it could be to the community's members that we were able to connect with, which is where we ended with our Climate Ready Uptown plan. So this is a brochure. It's about 18 inches wide by 24 inches long, that opens up. It opens up to be 18 inches wide by 24 inches long, but it is a small enough brochure that you can stick it into a desk or a to-go bag, and outlines your risk to extreme heat and flooding in Northern Manhattan. So on the, and if you don't mind dropping, I'm not sure actually if it has been dropped already, but I dropped the, oh nice, it's in the chat. You can actually download the PDF, just so if you wanted to zoom in and see what our plan looks like, you're welcome to, but I'll go over some screenshots of it here. We wanted to create a physical plan, because that was one piece of feedback that was really stressed to us, is that the city's resources, while good, are hard to understand. And also, if you don't have access to a computer are practically impossible to access. And so we wanted to have something physical that we could hand out and distribute to people, especially those that maybe don't have access to a computer or are not computer literate. And so on one side of our plan is information, which we're going to get to. On the other side is a really detailed map of Northern Manhattan that shows a bunch of different data sets to help people understand their risk as well as the resources that they have access to. And so I'm going to have some zoom ins actually, so let me keep going.
And Annie, just a few more minutes to wrap up.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks.
So this is the other side that has the information on it. So we had how to understand your risk related to extreme heat, how to prepare or cool down your apartment if there's an extreme heat advisory, and how to recognize heat-related illness, as well as some advocacy steps to help better improve the resiliency of our neighborhood. On the other side of the fold out, you had flooding. So it was flooding recovery, flooding before, how to prepare, what to do during a flood, especially if you're home versus if you're not home, and then how to recover from a flood. And all of this is really targeted towards people who are living in multifamily housing, living in apartment buildings, and specifically living in Northern Manhattan. On the back, where we had the map, we wanted to create something interactive. So there's steps here where people can actually mark their plan to personalize it to themselves. So we wanted people to mark their homes, understand what their risk of flood exposure was to both extreme rain and coastal flooding, understand which subways that around them were more likely to flood during an extreme rain or a coastal flooding event. Also understand where their closest evacuation center is, how to, mapping their route to the nearest hospital, would they have to cross potentially flooded streets? And also understanding a couple of other resources, like if there's a power outage, where to go to find somewhere to charge your phone or to get in contact with people. This just zooms in. We helped people identify their hurricane evacuation zone number and also talk through community contacts and building out emergency contacts and also just community connections, connecting with your neighbors. And this also just shows, I think, the real vulnerability that our neighbors in East Harlem are experiencing when it comes to floodings, both specifically extreme rain and coastal flooding. The other quick thing I want to note is that we have a QR code up in the top left corner. There was so much information that we wanted to include on here that wouldn't fit. And so wherever there was a little information sign, we actually had a link to read more about that specific topic through our QR code to help people, if they wanted to take this further, to learn more about how to help prepare their household for these extreme weather events. These are just a couple more images, and for timing's sake, I'm going to keep going. Also included in this was a magnet for preparing an emergency kit in a to-go bag with advice of what to put into that emergency kit. Yeah, I'm going to just jump to here really quickly to close out. So we created this plan. We were able to translate it into Spanish, and then it was really the job of getting this out into the community. So with the members of the Climate Justice Working Group, we planned out for a year, we planned out a Climate Ready Uptown Plan summer workshop series. We hosted 9 workshops across Northern Manhattan this summer, 2023, between May and August, talking to community members, giving everybody their own free copy of the plan and the magnet, and talking through with them how to use this plan, how to personalize it, and how to prepare and understand your risk to both flooding and extreme heat. The plan, I'm happy to say, was really widely received very well. People commented on how accessible it felt and how the language felt very simple, very plain, very straightforward. And that was exactly what I think we were trying to get at through all of these iterations of drafts and versions that we went through with Urban Systems Labs. One other exciting thing was we actually, our community members wanted to do this. We did pre and post surveys before every workshop. So we collected a lot of really interesting data on where, the average community member is at when we think about emergency preparedness, and where they felt that they were at after the workshop, or how, some of the areas where we can improve our workshop and our communication around different parts of emergency planning. And yeah, we distributed over 600 English speaking plans, about 200 Spanish speaking plans, and have, been asked by council members to run this series again next year. And so we're working actively to order additional plans and connect with different groups across Northern Manhattan to get these pamphlets out into the community. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Annie and Chantal. Both great presentations. And I already see there's a bunch of questions in the chat for both of you. So I'm going to hand it right over to Renee to moderate our Q&A.
Thanks, Julissa. Thank you. I will, there's a question for Annie, and then we'll maybe try to go to some of the more broader questions that both of you can answer. Were you able to compensate community members financially or in other ways for the work that they did?
Yeah, so we were able to compensate the focus group members who joined us. That was a much more extensive process. We were there for about 3 hours and really picking their brains to get the feedback that we needed. The creation of the Climate Ready Uptown Plan was a product of our Climate Justice Working Group, which is a member-based volunteer, space. And we would love to be able to compensate our members to the ability that we can. And we've even also plugged some of our members into professional opportunities based on the experiences that they gained here. But it was a lot of volunteer work to, amass the research, come up with the different copies of the actual language. And then we did pay Urban Systems Labs to put the whole plan together. So yeah, so members were not paid for a lot of the planning work, but it is something that was a clear ask of the community to do.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to shift gears. There was a question here about the relationship between climate resilience and gentrification, and I'm happy to see that this is an important topic for our network of equitable development, or greening and building resilience without adding to displacement pressures and disproportionately impacted communities. So I guess the question, so I'm kind of adding on to the question from the chat, is, how do you see community-driven planning, like what you two have talked about today, as an important step of building resilience while also helping residents stay in place?
Chantal, I recognize I talked a lot, so I'll let you go.
No worries, thanks. Yeah, this is a big question and a deep question, but I think to keep it short and sweet, I would just say that for me, and in the context of the work that I do, community-driven planning is about building community power and letting community lead. It does not mean letting community do everything, which sometimes happens, like the work is shifted to them. But it is about letting community lead, sharing power, and making sure that community priorities are given priority in the decision-making processes. So I think that would help balance the work towards community resilience and avoid or lessen the impacts of gentrification.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I can also add that definitely, because I think what happens is in neighborhoods that are gentrifying, the city comes in, and at least in New York, I can say the city comes in and with, these big plans and nobody's consulted on them. And so it feels, it can blindside community members, and it does feel sometimes like these plans are not meant for us, because why is it that now we're getting the investments when we've needed them for so long? And I think at WeAct, what we are increasingly pushing towards is that you can't decouple environmental justice and climate justice from housing justice. We've worked to join a statewide housing coalition. We're pushing for basic tenant protections. We're pushing for more funding for our public housing, because even though maybe those aren't on their face environmental justice issues, they are absolutely climate justice issues. And so we want to see more cross collaboration between these two movements. And that's something that we're actively working on in New York City.
Thank you so much, both of you, for that. There's a question here about scheduling, that scheduling can be tricky. Can you share your best practices for planning community meetings? How did you go about figuring out times or dates to maximize attendance, accessibility for working people, parents, and different audiences?
I'll let you answer that one, Annie.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's like, there's never a right answer. There's only, it's never gonna work for everybody. I think, historically, we've tried to do our meetings more at night so that if people are working during the day, they can make it. I hate that I'm saying this, but Zoom is actually very convenient for a lot of people because especially if you have young kids or you have a long commute, you can still make it to a meeting where even though we are a community-based organization and the majority of our members live within a 20-minute walk of our offices, that's not always a possibility on a weekday night. For some of the, I think one thing that we've tried to do when possible is like if we have capacity to run meetings, especially like when we were collecting input from community members, run them twice. So there's 2 options for people to come to. If they can't make one, they can make the other. That's not always possible though. And I think for the regular meetings with like our climate justice working group members of consistency, so that we're not constantly moving times and dates around, which can then conflict with other responsibilities. But instead, if they know, every second Wednesday at 7 p.m. we have the standing meeting. Sometimes there will be conflicts, but for when they can clear their schedules, they can. So it's tricky for sure.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add is that, and something we encourage folks in our network to do is if there's an opportunity to either raise funds for or have volunteers bring food to the meeting, and also raise funds for childcare, that really makes a difference.
Yeah, thank you both. This one is for Chantal about the planning framework. Is it being implemented at the local level only, or are there ways for NACRP members to incorporate the framework at other levels? So county, state, or, like a larger planning efforts for climate resilience?
Yeah, I think there are definitely opportunities to scale the framework up and work at different levels, such as the state level, but in my work, it's been more so at the local level and at a smaller scale. And I think we are actively working at ways to kind of explain and guide folks through how to scale up their projects beyond the city and local government level.
Great, thank you. Annie, this one is very specific to the work and the heat index mapping, I think. Were you able to map individual or census block access to cooling and or home AC? And if so, at what scale and how?
That's a really great question. So the access to cooling is a hard one. New York City does have a network of cooling centers, which are public spaces where you can access cooling if there's a heat advisory. The reason that you didn't see them on the map is because that is a very underfunded program, and it essentially has a budget of $0. So every morning of a heat advisory, the city is calling places that have volunteered to be cooling centers and calls to find out if they're open or closed. And so every day of a heat advisory, the available cooling centers change. So we didn't want to put them on a map where then that might not be accurate information and somebody could walk 10 blocks to what they think is a cooling center that's closed. Instead, we tried to give people information of, know where your closest library is, because those are always cooling centers and they're almost always open during the days, and tried to also explain the realities of this program. As for the air conditioning access, I will admit right now that I am not remembering which. I think it's part of the ACS surveys. Someone might actually know this better than I do. But that is, I can't actually answer that question about like how deep we've mapped it. The heat vulnerability index is a city index, so the Department of Health has actually created that, and they list out the factors that are included.
Great, thank you. We have just a couple of more minutes, and I just want to give you both an opportunity to share any last words of wisdom or what keeps you motivated doing this work, because it's not always easy.
I can go first. Without risking sounding cliche, I do think that the connections and the community members that you meet is for me one of the biggest motivations. Every time we do an in-person meeting or even a Zoom meeting, you leave it feeling such a like robust sense of gratitude and you know, energy and care for the people that you're working with and for. Yeah, and I think that that is also a really key factor in like a community's resiliency of having these connections, making sure you're checking on your neighbors, making sure you're checking on older folks that you know who might be living alone. And so the more relationships that we build and the opportunities we get to come together, I think the stronger we are against some of these events. And, you know, just, you know, saying we didn't have any connection with the East Harlem COAD before the planning of the Climate Ready Uptown Plan. Now they're a key partner that we work with across, you know, so many different projects. And I think there's a lot of strengths and of these relationships. So I think that's kind of something that does definitely keep me going.
Thank you, Annie. That was so beautiful, and I echo and share everything you just said. That resonates so much. And also, you know, this is really heart-centered work, and it's really heavy. Sometimes too, there have been calls where I'm working with community members and they're describing their planning process and we're trying to support them on their project. And, you know, there are some emotional moments where either they end up crying because it's really hard or I end up crying. And so it really is heart-centered, emotional work. And there are opportunities in this work to heal together because, right, this is like, you know, historical legacy of things that we're grappling with and seeking to change and transform systems. So these things don't happen over, you know, months or years, but it's a continual process that we're working on changing and systems that we're working on subverting for the long term. So just keeping that in mind. And like Annie said, continuing to check on people, checking on your neighbors, and to also give yourself time for rest. Rest is really important to to avoid burnout so that you can continue to do this work at this level, I would say.
Yeah, thank you both so much. We do have just a couple of slides to end off here. I just really big thank you to both of our speakers. Thank you for coming and sharing your wisdom and your heart with us. Really appreciate it. You can connect with others on the issues of equity and climate resilience. So we have your names from the poll at the beginning. If you didn't get an opportunity to weigh in there, please drop your email address in the chat. You can tell us what you think about our training sessions here. So you'll see the evaluation link in the chat as well. We have one more webinar in this series in January. You can join us in January on the 17th for a workforce development focused presentations. So thank you so much from the River Network, Groundwork USA, Urban Waters Learning Network. We appreciate you all for hanging in this long and for being here with us today. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.